on current approaches to STI. You might know already, the online training is organized by the Workstream 6 on capacity building. It is part of the interagency task team of the UN, and it is currently part of the technology facilitation mechanism of the UN. At the moment, we have two conveners, which are UNCTAD and UNESCO, who are convening this group. But we have many other agencies involved. We have UNIDO, we have UNU, we have all the regional commissions, we have WIPO, ITU, many other agencies are also involved. My name is Ludovico Alcorta. I am a professorial fellow on technology and innovation for sustainable development at the United Nations University Maastricht Economic Research Institute for Innovation and Technology. I've also been director of research and statistics at UNIDO, and I was luckily involved in the preparation of the technical documents that supported SDG 8 and 9. Well, so before we move on, I would like to start with some technical housekeeping, so that we can make this online webinar much more easy going. We are using actually MS Teams. You might have noticed that already. Please turn your cameras on only if the connection is good and if you're going to discuss something. Otherwise, turn your camera off, except now at the beginning of the introduction or at the end, because we would like to take at some stage a group photo. So for the time being, don't turn it off. But when we start with the presentations, please turn them off. And keep your microphone muted while the presentations are going on and while you're not speaking, because otherwise we get a lot of background noise. If you want to intervene, please raise your hand, and when you are given the floor, please unmute yourselves and come up with your comments. The chat can be used throughout the presentation. You just can type in the chat whenever you want and ask questions or write comments or whatever you want in the chat. Okay, who are we? Myself, as I said, Ludovico Alcorta. We have as Cornelia Sinova, who is a program assist specialist in science policy and capacity building at UNESCO. She's been in UNESCO nearly 20 years, and she's in charge of the STI policy programs, particularly the Global Observatory on STI Policy Instruments, OSPI. We also have with us Clovis Freire, who is an economist and a computer engineer specializing in technological change and innovation. He's at UNCTAD, and he's currently in charge of the Innovation Report 2020. He's also doing some STI policy advice in Ethiopia. In addition, we have Nicolo Giglio, who is our colleague from CEPAL. He's been working on business support for nearly 20 years. And currently he's, as I said, in ECLA. He's been 5 years already. And he is working on the new technologies unit at CEPAL. Another of our participants, our speakers today, is Anders Johnson, who is head of the innovation policy section at the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. He is in charge of the innovation policy reviews of the commission. Plus, he's developing a new product which is called the Innovation Policy Outlook, which focuses on 6 countries in the region. He's worked before in the OECD, in the World Forum, and now he's moved to the UN. We have also with us Senmei Wang and Desponi Susoni, who are supporting us from UNESCO. And unfortunately, we were supposed to have Ralph Hamdick from UN Economic Commission for Europe, but he at last moment got sick. but we have other colleagues that are participating here from the IATT and the Capacity Working Group. We have Victor Conde from the Economic Commission in Africa. We have Fernando Santiago from UNIDO, and we have other colleagues that will be able to participate as the process. That's session one. Last session we were part of focus on more generic and strategic aspects of science and technology policy making in the context of SDGs. We discussed strategic STI policy making. We also discussed the role of science in STI policy making. And we had several countries, examples, Ethiopia, and several countries around the world. This session today shifts gear and moves into two important steps or stages in the policy process. It first addresses the design stage and how to design policy instruments that can be eventually implemented, which is the second part of our presentation. It can be implemented by the different governments involved. Next session will focus on innovation and entrepreneurship, but I'll get back to that at the end of this session. Essentially, the presentation today will be divided in several parts. We begin with the first presentation, which is about designing technology and innovation policy instruments. Then we will have a very short session on a very concrete example on innovation calls in Latin America, how research calls take place in the context of the pandemic. And issues of implementation. The first part focuses on implementation challenges, and that is followed by the experience of a number of countries around the world. We have an open discussion, and then we will wrap up and finish. The webinar is meant to last 2 hours. Okay, having said that, I will now ask my colleague, Clovis Freire, to give us the first presentation of today on the designing of policy instruments. Clovis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ludo. Colleagues, I'll make this presentation together with my colleague, Cornelia Znova. So the objective of this presentation is to provide an overview of the concepts of policy instruments. So let's then start with the definitions. What are policy instruments? To answer this question, let's step back a bit to the discussion of the first webinar, the STI policies. STI policies set the direction of scientific production, technological learning, and innovation. For example, STI that leads to more jobs, green growth, reduced poverty, and so on. STI policy instruments are the tools used to shape the economic activities and institutions to reach the goals set by the STI policy. The way that these tools shape economic activities is through promoting innovation. In general, we need more than one tool to do the job. So we need policy mix or policy portfolio. And this policy mix could deal with both sides of the creative and destruction of innovation. For example, if the goal is STI for green growth, we need policy instruments to promote renewable energy sectors, for example, but also instruments to phase out carbon-based energy sectors. So what are the types of STI policy instruments for sustainable development? We can think about many ways in which we can classify them. One is considering a sectoral or horizontal approach. A sectoral instrument targets some particular sectors like garment, textile, software, or green innovation. A horizontal instrument is cross-cutting. For example, a human resource development fund for scientific capacity in general, or a program for SME innovation. Sectoral STI policy instruments could deliver bigger returns for the investment. For example, suppose we need to design an STI policy instrument to promote green growth. And we find that 3 sectors account for most of the carbon emissions in the country. Then deploying green technologies in these 3 sectors may be more effective than a horizontal policy instrument aiming to promote sustainable production in general. Another way to classify policy instruments is considering actors in the national innovation system that are the key target for the policy instrument. For example, when targeting the private sector, we can develop tools to stimulate more innovation in existing innovative firms, or we can enlarge the base of innovative firms, or we can attract innovative firms from abroad, or promote new firms within the existing sectors to increase the potential number of firms that could become innovative. Or we can have policy instruments to promote new sectors in the economy altogether. Similarly, targeting other actors in the innovation system will result in different policy mix of policy instruments. We can also classify STI policy instruments by the type of innovation that they promote. If we want to promote economic diversification, for example, we need product innovation. The instruments will change if the objective is to promote an innovation that is new to the world, or is new to the country, or only new to a firm. So, for example, for a product innovation that is new to the world, we could have a policy instrument such as Innovation Hub, targeting Industry 4.0 technologies. Or to promote product innovation that is new to the firm, we could have a policy instrument such as business advisory services that build the capacity of innovation of firms. If we want to increase productivity, the policy instruments will promote process innovation. They will be related to things such as technology transfer, facilitate importation of new machinery, or certification of standards of production. Policy instruments for institutional innovation will be very different. There will be things like capacity building programs, networking, and so on. Still, another way to classify policy instruments is to focus on the supply or demand. If you want to promote the supply side of innovation, these instruments may focus on building technological and innovation capabilities of the different actors of the national innovation system. Or they will focus on the finance for innovation or the required infrastructure, for example, digital infrastructure. Another way to devise policies, instruments focus on supply side is to consider the entire supply chain of the sector in which we want to promote innovation. For example, if we want to promote innovation in the garment sector, we may also include policy instruments that make the textile sector also more innovative, or that increase the performance and the quality of the cotton sector. We can also have policy instruments focus on the demand side, for example, to increase the demand of a new product. That can be done through financing consumption or through tax and tax rebates, but also through awareness programs, for example, to educate people on the need for reducing carbon footprint to address climate change. Still, another way to classify policy instruments is related to the level of the intervention. For example, in the supply side, that can range from incentives, tax, subsidies, to the provision of infrastructure, or the role of coordinating the action in the national innovation system. Or participation of the government, of the state on the production, such as when the state is a co-creator of a sector that did not exist in the economy before. Some examples are, for instance, the aeronautic industry in Brazil in the 1950s, or the cut flower industry in Ethiopia in the 2000s, or the kickstart of the solar industry in China. In the demand side, the level of intervention, for example, would range from information like labels, certifications, to tax incentives or direct procurement. Now, another way to classify policy instruments is by action areas, for the lack of a better term. These are, for example, regulations or capacity building information or trade and so on. I have 4 slides that list several policy instruments classified by these action areas, and you will receive this presentation later. So I will mention just a few of them. For example, policy instruments for capacity building could include business advisory services, business incubators, and market intelligence services. In the case of economic policy instruments, some examples include R&D funding and innovation funding for companies. Or in the case of fiscal instruments, there are tax incentives. And in the case of trade, a common policy instrument is the trade tariffs. So I will skip the next 2 slides, but you will receive them now after the meeting. So now let me invite my colleague Cornelia to share with us some examples of the policy instruments from several countries. Cornelia?
Yes, thank you, Clovis. I would like to show a few country examples of policy instruments to illustrate their different dimensions according to action areas, goals, supply or demand side, level of intervention, target groups. So, for example, research funds that aim to strengthen scientific knowledge production. We have an example of horizontal instrument in the case of Ghana, or a sectorial instrument in the example of Mexico. Also, programs and funds that aim to develop innovation and strategic technological areas. For instance, with target groups on SMEs in the example from Costa Rica, or starts up a target group in the case of Uzbekistan, or some broader beneficiaries in the example of Kuwait. To strengthen capacities and increase social appropriation of science and new technologies. Here I took an example from an instrument in Kenya. The category of objectives goes beyond, including also other type of objectives, such as promoting gender equality in STI, or promoting open science and open access to data, or category of objectives such as integrating indigenous knowledge. So these are just a few examples of instruments with their objectives. Next slide, please, Clovis. The common aspect of each policy instrument is that they have all these different dimensions defined as part of their design: the typology, objective, the issue tackled, concrete outputs, strategy to achieve their results, the beneficiary, the target group, also definition of whether they are competitive or accessible to all the group of beneficiaries, defining also the source and amount of funding, time frame. Next slide, please, Clovis. I would like to add another very important dimension for classifying policy instruments, and this is the Sustainable Development Goals. Each policy instrument can be analyzed according to its link to specific targets of the SDGs, and such analysis will contribute not only to monitor the instrument itself, but it will also be very helpful to monitor the actual contribution of STI for the achievement of the SDGs. And this slide that you see shows actually some of this classification as extracted from our database of policy instruments according to their link to specific targets of the SDGs. So most of the examples that I gave, and most of the examples of, in general, of STI policy instruments contribute a lot to targets of the SDG 9, also SDG 8, but also some sectoral SDGs like the SDG 6 on water and sanitation, or SDG 7 on energy. So this is all from my side. Thank you for your attention. I pass back the floor to Clovis. Thank you.
Thank you, Cornelia. So now let us focus on the steps for designing of a policy mix. So based on the discussions that we had so far, one way to go through this process is by answering a set of questions like what are the goals of the policy instruments? What is the current situation of the national innovation system and the current policy instruments? You also need to know where you are now. What are the economic sectors and institutions that need to be shaped to reach the goals? What are the key actors of the national innovation systems involved in these sectors and activities? And what are the supply and demand factors that need to be changed and how you plan to do it? And what is the level of intervention in the supply and demand side that the policy will have, the policy instrument will have? And who are they responsible for the policy instruments? Is the STI ministry, the STI agency, or is another ministry? So the design and implementation of STI policy instruments, it becomes very complex because the systemic nature of the SDGs, the diversity of actors involved, the diversity of the policy instruments, including policy instruments that were designed for other issues and that affect innovation unintentionally. For example, exchange rate policy, which has a big impact on exports of new products and also on import of technology. So let me finish this presentation with a list of few key principles that we must keep in mind. First, that policy instruments should have directionality. They are tools for a purpose. It's also necessary to have a participatory process. It's critical to have that. A major role of the STI ministry, the STI agency, is to coordinate the implementation. And we should be open to experimentation on that. Monitoring evaluation is key. And this is a continuous process of assessing progress, adjusting the policy mix, and coordinating the implementation. With that, Ludo, I finished the presentation. Thank you.
There is a question by Joshua Ombaka.
Okay, this is Joshua from Kenya. Now, I think it's Cornelia, not Clovis, but sorry for that. Yeah, on her last slide, I could see some of the representations were in hyphen, and I know that this Gospin tool currently is when most of the African countries are in the process of populating their data. Does it mean that it is missing, or you have done something more exhaustive to the point that means that it is totally not there, such policy instruments? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Joshua, for this question. Yes, just a clarification on this, that yes, these are just examples that I were able to extract. The database is still in the process of being populated, so it means that either these instruments are missing for the countries that we had already surveyed, or that we hadn't yet received information, or that we hadn't surveyed yet. So it could be both, but in principle, when it means that there are no policy instruments that were identified.
I would like to move now to the next presentation, who's a practical case in Latin America by Nicolo Giglio and Nicolo, you have the floor now.
Good morning to Latin America. Good night to Asia. I want to present a specific case about the question that we had at the beginning of the pandemic was, what were the science and technology and innovation ministries or agencies or institutions in charge of of the science and technology innovation policy were doing. Most of the institutions that were in charge of taking a leading role in the pandemic are the Ministry of Health. But we were working closely with these other kind of institutions, science and technology, so we wanted to know what we're specifically doing to help fight the COVID-19. So in order to do that, we review 19 Latin American countries, specifically what, as I said, what the science and technology and innovation ministries or agencies were doing. And we did this research during a week between the 8th and 15th of April, at the beginning of what was the pandemic here in Latin America. So what we found out is that most of these countries were launching some sort of innovation calls, and for most of them, this was the only thing that they were doing. Of the 19 countries that you can see on the table there, 13 were implementing and launching these calls. We look at all of them, and we classify them in terms of if they were general or specific calls, the time frame for the application process, if they were closed or still open at the moment, and the total budget available for these calls. And when I'm talking about innovation calls, I'm talking about a process where institutions, researchers, or companies present innovation projects to this institution that is carrying out this call. They receive them, they evaluate them, and then run in a contest process in order to allocate the available resources to the winning projects. When I'm talking about general or specific calls, here are two examples in order to visualize what I'm talking about. Colombia launched the MinScienciathon. This is a call to present projects that contribute to the solution of problem health related to COVID-19. They want to accelerate proposals presented by scientists, researchers, and innovators. And they define 5 thematic lines: public health, diagnostic systems, prevention and treatment strategies, equipment and devices, and monitoring systems. You can see that this call is very broad, is confined in the COVID-19 issues, but it's very broad on all the topics that they want to approach. And they decide to finance 25 projects, 5 on each of these lines. On the contrary, in Chile, they launched the COVID-19 Innovation Challenge. This was a very focused call. They wanted solutions for local demand for protection elements. There was a shortage, as in any other country. Global value chains were broken, so we didn't have all the protective equipment like masks, face shields, or suits for the people that work on hospital to help fight the COVID-19. So the Ministry of Science decided to launch a specific call in order to provide technological solutions to face this shortage. In general terms, 10 of the 13 countries that we researched were launching general scope calls, and 5 of them specific calls. 2 of them, to add up to 13, 2 of them were doing both. Of the countries that launched general scope calls, in these calls, most of them consider both R&D projects and also technological development projects. But the 5 countries that launched these specific calls, most of them were specifically directed to technological development. Okay, in the case of Chile, they also provide, as part of the material to present the project, for example, all the patents that were available to use them in this issue. So the signal was very clear. It's that all the basic research was done. What we need is to accelerate and find a very fast, a productive solution and go into production. The budget. If you consider the countries that we have, they have information for these calls, it adds up to $25 million for all these countries. If you consider the countries that we didn't have the information on hand, and we made an estimate, so for the 13 countries, all these calls, all these projects add up to $30 million that were going to be allocated in this process. The large resources were allocated to calls of general scope, with almost 2/3 of the estimated budget. Time and urgency. This was being very fast. Countries need solutions. They need to approach and fight the COVID-19. So these were launched very fast, and also the application process, the days that institutions, researchers, and companies have in order to present this project was very short. In average, 12 days. At the moment of the research, all these calls that were closed and in the process, and they were in the process of the evaluation, the average was 9.4 days, and the calls that were still open, the average were 18 days. So some reflections about this process, these instruments, and some open questions that we have in order to discuss. First, this was a very quick response. That's a positive note. The countries respond very quickly at the beginning of the beginning of the pandemic in Latin America with these innovation calls. But at the same time, they respond with what they used to do. Most of these countries in these institutions, the only instrument that they really have in order to support science, technology, innovation is contest of call for projects. So what they did is what they are accustomed to do. And we have a saying, I don't know if you have it too, when you have a hammer, everything is a nail. Okay? So some of the questions are if there are other possibilities rather than this specific instrument of these specific calls that this institution should do or not. The other positive note is that this approach, these specific calls focus on COVID-19, and some of the countries more in deep focus in a specific subject makes them decrease some kind of fear to directionality. In Latin America, there's a kind of, I would say that some kind of ideology that frame the design of instruments in the form of horizontal and neutral intervention. There's some kind of fear to direct and to focus in specific subjects. So this challenge or more mission-oriented approach, I think is a positive note. Just let me finish with two questions. Given the funds available by each country, the research and development capacities, and the urgency for result, and the magnitude of the challenge, is this type of competition, is this type of innovation calls the most appropriate mechanism? Or is it the most appropriate mechanism in the way that they implement it? First, you have limited resources, $25–30 million for 13 countries to find solutions to fight the COVID is not too much money. And these are distributed, these funds are distributed among multiple projects, which ultimately makes demand per project very low. Okay? So this is one question. Of course, there's a rationality behind a contest. But one could question if having several research teams competing in a race against each other, trying to find the same result, is the best mechanism. Wouldn't it be more convenient to add all these efforts, both intellectual and financial, rather than having different teams competing? Can we force a consortium? Can we force these associative projects? Not just encourage, can we force them? Can we do something at the regional level? You don't only have teams competing for the same result in your country, but also you have countries competing for the same result in the same region. Should it be better to have these joint projects? And with these questions, I would like to finish my presentation.
Thank you very much, Nicolo. Look, I'm collecting questions. I have collected all the questions that you put in the chat so far. We will address them. But just before we discuss the presentations that we had, let me test you with a couple of Mentimeter questions that we had planned for this stage of the webinar. Perhaps, in fact, I would like to start with one question that it relates precisely to the presentation you have heard a minute ago. And the question is, in the context of your organization, either offering or demanding support, do you prefer a general scope or a more focused innovation call? So do you want to invest in an open-ended call so that you get lots of projects, but each project gets little amount of money, or you prefer a focused approach where you get a few projects, but these projects are more generously funded? What choices would you make? Remember to look into the chat. You can see a link there. I'm seeing it now. Press on the link and you'll be accessing the Mentimeter. There's still a few of you that haven't done it yet. Please just click on the chat icon and you'll be able to access the. Okay, we'll see. We're getting, yes, a few more. Click on the link you can see at this very moment. It's very visible, the link at the moment. So please click on it. And I would like to pick up on that question in a minute. Okay, it's massively in favor of focus approach, and we will ask why. We'll discuss why in a few minutes. Why? I would like now to ask one more Mentimeter question before we enter the discussion. What are the two top key STI policy instruments in your country? Okay, choose two and tell us which ones are the top two instruments in your country. I think we're not getting any more answers, and you can see from the Mentimeter that around 30% the participants have used an R&D funding as the main mechanism to main policy instrument to promote technology innovation in their countries. That's a very, very significant number, because I would have expected that in many of the countries you come from, the support for R&D is much lower than what it is. Local entrepreneurship and business incubation comes second, and that is also close to R&D, because it's focusing on building entrepreneurship and innovation within enterprises. It would be interesting to check whether the R&D funding is more for science-related research or more for development, and to see whether it's more business-oriented or science-oriented. But it's, for me, quite revealing the fact that there's significant amount of R&D. Look, I think we will stop with the Mentimeter. I have, please raise your hands now if you want to ask a question. If any of you want to ask a question, please raise your hand now. Carola Medina.
Hello. Good morning.
Yes, please. Carola, good morning. Just morning for you, isn't it?
Yes, thank you. My name is Carola Medina from Costa Rica. I just want to share Costa Rica's experience in the context of COVID-19. And I just want to mention that beyond this context, we did a job with the universities and private sector for the development of a specific medical devices such as mechanical respirators.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, we reached the same conclusion that Mario indicated. I think it is better perhaps to join forces in 1-2 country projects. And this is because we have regulatory aspect that we have to resolve in the process so that developments could be resolved in less time than usual given the pandemic, of course. And at the end, we have to overcome many challenges from a regulatory perspective related, for example, to preclinical and clinical processes. So dedicating efforts to 1 or 2 projects was less complex, perhaps, so we can be able to integrate different actors from the same user, doctors, universities, companies, engineering, etc. And so I think I have to agree with what Mario mentioned.
Nicolo.
Nicolo, I'm sorry.
This is Aide Orozco from Mexico.
Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, I have shared in the chat a brief comment about how Mexico has been approaching the COVID-19 challenge. Of course, by early April, that I believe this comparison was made. Probably the very first steps of the general innovation call was launched. But from there to this moment, a lot of things have happened. We have invested mostly our efforts in precisely focused calls, and not only calls in a general way. We have been promoting the cooperation between sectors with very specific goals. For example, the one that I have mentioned in the chat, the production of invasive respirators, we have already right now being distributed in all of our provinces, more than 1,000 invasive respirators produced 100% in Mexico. And we took prototypes in around the technology readiness level of 5, and we very focusedly accompanied them until the industrial escalation. So we did it in 5 months versus the standard process for such developments normally take between 3 to 5 years. So this type of approach, articulating very focused results and objectives, is working for us. So in this same way, we have produced other medical devices, and also we are working with very specific vaccines in Mexico that will be ready by the middle of 2021. So this type of information I'm very happy to share with all of you in a more, let's say, consistent and organized way if there is any interest. Because what we saw in the presentation, I think, was a very early stage of what we were doing, at least in Mexico. So I'm very happy to share more information if interested.
Thank you very much, Delia. We have a channel to do that sharing, and we will follow up with you. Wilhelmina, you raised your hand too. Maybe you can ask your question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I think that for us here in Ghana, a typical Africa country situation, we are looking at the COVID as a shared responsibility among all the different sectors. So for instance, that race sector, which is so close to us, being an agri-economy, had a policy response. But in all of these, though the health sector is the key sector, in all of these, we realize that STI cut across. So our ministry was also given the chance to come up with a policy and an instrument that can connect all these other sectors, the health, the agriculture, education, and also water and sanitation, because here we are dealing with water for washing hands, and especially dealing with the waste that is coming from all these, that is the hospital waste management, as well as also looking at the issues to do with stigmatization. So it is really, here you look at STI for a more shared and concerted effort, well coordinated, to make sure that everybody is also part, he or himself as part of the solution to the problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Any comments from the presentators? If not, I will add a couple of questions that come from so that you can prepare your answers. There's one question that comes from Samuel Party. Given that STI is cross-cutting, will you categorize sector, for example, water, energy, agricultural policies and plans and financial investment plans under an STI policy instrument? And Wilhelmina, also you asked something else. Can you share some practical example of a vertical STI policy instrument? So the floor is back to the presentators, Clovis and
Yes.
Nicolo.
So Ludo, thank you, and thank you, colleague, for these questions. So in terms of the, let me give an answer, and of course I also would like to hear the colleagues' views. The first question is if policies in other areas can also be, or policy instruments in other areas can also be considered STI policy instruments. I think what is interesting to consider as a STI policy instrument, the STI aspect, is that this policy instrument should affect the innovation process. So either the scientific production or technological learning or innovation process per se. So we can always argue then the innovation is the driver or economic growth and progress. So ultimately everything may be able to affect innovation, but if it's better to not go too far with that consideration and think about the tools that impact very closely the innovation process of that sector. Let me give an example. If you want to increase the process innovation in a sector and you want to facilitate the importation of new machinery, capital goods. So if you have a trade instrument to reduce tariffs on a particular class of machinery, that is a very specific instrument that has a very specific impact on STI, on innovation, on the sector that you want to act. So I would consider that being one aspect. And in case of the other question on the vertical example, is the examples, for instance, that Nicolo was saying. So Nicolo may want to comment on this, some very specific instruments for the COVID-19, to respond to COVID-19.
First, one comment to Delia. Delia, yes, I will accept your offer, and if you can send some information about what Mexico is doing right now, I will appreciate that, because we are working on that issues at this moment in ECLAC-CEPAL. The example that I presented, it was presented with training purposes. Of course, we did it at the beginning of April, and it was really focused on what were the innovation calls. When we did this research, we realized that most of the countries were doing the innovation calls, so we focused on innovation calls. launched by specific institutions. So it's a very focused approach, and I didn't. My intention was not to present all the strategy that the country was doing to fight the COVID, but we are, as I said, we are working on that issues too. So I would really appreciate it if you can send the information that you offer. In terms of examples of focus or sectoral instrument, these are one of these. These are focused in a specific problem. This is very vertical. Others are focused in sectors. For example, in Corfo, they kind of copy the approach of the European Union. So they were in a process for several years working on what they call strategic projects, and they focus on specific industries. For example, the solar industry, and they prepare a roadmap in order to take advantage of the opportunities of the solar conditions in the north of Chile. So they join forces with the private sector, the research institutions, etc., and prepare a project to take advantage of the solar condition and create a national solar industry to approach that. This is another example of instead of a specific problem or subject, this is a specific sector, and they approach with a specific instrument.
Okay, we are in time. We can have a question, time for one more question if somebody wants to add something. The two questions here. I have learned a new term called force consortium. You can share some approaches to forcing such a consortium. I presume they refer to research consortium, however. So top-down force.
It's not a new term. I was trying to make a point. It's in the sense that I think that who was Carola from Costa Rica. I think that she presented her explanation very well, in the sense that instead of having multiple projects, what can you do in order to have one or two projects? And what can you do in order to not to wait and see what happened and see how many projects you receive for many institutions? What can you do in order to and I use the word force instead of strongly motivated. This kind of approach where you don't receive a lot of projects with different institutions, but a group of institutions or companies to present one project and join forces.
Clovis, do you have something to add there? And just, there is a rather generic question, but maybe you can think about it. Can you provide some guidelines as to how to design a policy instrument? Some three or four key aspects of design. Clovis?
Yes. So yeah, that's the steps that we try to show in the presentation. It was exactly that. So in a way, you have to have first the objective. Let's take the example of the COVID-19. You want to have innovation to address the COVID-19 in certain aspect, but you want to be more focused. You have the objective of, for instance, have the respirators. So then you can identify, do you have the policy instruments now to do that? So the country may not have anything, any policy instrument, any incentive, any program that would target that particular sector, that particular area. So then you can go to the next step. Okay, what are the main actors that you need to act to have that happening? So in this case, for instance, the private sector, maybe changing the production of a close product that is similar to the respirator, or coming up with new production of the respirator. Then the next step, okay, you should incentivize the demand or the supply side. Clearly, demand side, you don't need to incentivize it in this case. you incentivize the supply side. But by doing what? What level the intervention? Maybe you want something very fast, so you don't only want to raise awareness or create incentives that take long time. So you may want to have something very direct. Even in some countries, join the production to that. And then you can also consider, okay, who will be taking this policy? Will be the STI ministry itself or another agency, another ministry that will be acting? For how long time will be doing? So other things that Cornelia mentioned, how long will be the period? How much money will be investing? And as well, if we consider it will be all firms can participate on that, or there will be some kind of competition. So all those are questions that you have to go through in this process of designing the policy instrument.
Okay,
so that's one example.
I will pick up one more question that Roy Mugira has been raising his hand for a while. So
thank you very much, Ludo. I'm the one who asked about the forced consortium, and I want to follow for the response, because I was waiting for that word, strongly motivate. In other words, incentivize strongly so that a team can come together. That is a comment, Chairman. Thank you.
thank you. Okay, with that, I will now shift the moderation to Cornelia, who's going to now start moderating myself.
Yes, thank you, Ludo. Thank you for this first part of our session. Now we would like to move to the second part and to focus more on the implementation challenges related to STI policy instruments. So here I would like to give the floor to Ludo, Ludovico Alcorta from UN-IATT, who present us some challenges related to the implementation of STI policy instruments. Ludo, please, the floor is yours.
So, okay. Thank you. Let me start by saying that the first part was on design. Now we're moving to implementation. And this draws on an experience that I developed over 3 years in the GCC or in a GCC country. I have backing for all examples of all of these, but I prefer to concentrate on the more generic aspects, and then we can discuss in detail afterwards the examples. Okay, so what is implementation about? Implementation is essentially about execution and operationalization. It's the third stage in the policy cycle, and it is about operationalizing the design that's taking place in the first stage. It has some specific characteristics. First, it is a proof of concept. It's a proof of concept because you're trying to test in reality where the designs of policies, whether they work, whether stakeholders agree with it, whether there are some practical obstacles that affect the implementation of it. It's very much a social and political process. It's a social and political process because there are different beneficiaries. There are those that pay for it. There's the bureaucracy. There is those that have nothing to do with the policy. There are different social groups that will participate and interact in relationship to the. It's also a political process because there are clear interests here. And interests some are benefits, some are not. And they will try to exercise their power during the implementation process. It is also a change process. And why it is a change process is because many of these instruments are aimed at changing behavior. And not everybody wants their behavior changed, and people are reticent and resist change behavior. So you have to manage the process of resistance to turn resistance into support. And finally, it's a managerial process. Implementation is about management, resources, about making decisions, about making choices. And that is essentially the key characteristics of the implementation process. Now, what are the challenges there? This is not moving. Okay. The first challenge is a planning challenge. Okay? And in order to be able to implement properly, you have to have all your medium, short, long-term planning in line, very well in line with all the actions that are required to implement the policy. But you also need something else, and this is something that I've noticed in some countries that lacks completely: the operational plans of the institutions involved in implementing policy. They just do not do their own working plans, and without working plans, medium, long-term don't work. These plans should include calendar, should include roles and responsibilities, should include targets and performance indicators, should include costing, not only of the measures themselves, but also costing of implementing the process, because there are costs involved. The next challenge relates to the assistance approach. And the issue here is, as we've been discussing a bit ago about COVID, okay, COVID required a massive response in many areas. In PPE, in vaccines, in healthcare, in different areas. And this is because in pandemia like this are systemic. And many of the science and technology implementation problems are systemic, let alone because they have to take into account external factors like that come into the picture. So it is very important to have a systemic approach that identifies inputs and outputs, that identifies key STI actors, that identifies the social, economic, and political relationships between key actors, and that looks into the social, economic, and political effects. And all this has to be looked holistically and comprehensively. If you move one variable, all the other variables will be affected. It may go against the initial policy and the initial effect you had in mind. Third challenge is leadership. And this I've noticed also that it's a very important dimension that is not taken into account. For an STI policy or a significant STI policy to work, it must have top government priority. And by top government priority, I mean the prime president, the parliamentary. It must also have ministerial priority. The minister or the head of the agency, implementing agency, must be convinced that this is worthwhile. That doesn't happen very often. It's just about going through the motions. It's not about fighting for their policies. And you need champions. Champions are those people that advocate, promote, that push, that sell policies. And you need a few champions located in strategic places within the executing agencies, as well as in other agencies, in other ministries, and in the private sector. To do this, you can draw on the STI bureaucracy. The STI bureaucracy can, through their influence on their superiors or through their influence in their peers, can generate a coalition of interests and advocate for STI policy. But they have to be willing to be involved, to push, to promote the STI policies. And finally, if you have a group of committed people that believe strongly in the STI policies, you have to get them to use their networks, use their commitment as a source of energy to expand and promote and convince others that its STI policies are necessary. Of course, governance, without proper governance, you cannot implement anything. And here, one of the observations we have is that for any in policy, you always need an overarching multi-stakeholder representative consulting or decision-making power at the top that looks into all the policies, looks at the problem systemically, and coordinates across sectors. Below there must be a body that has the overall responsibility for implementation, like a DG, a Director General, or a Vice Minister, or a Minister itself, or an agency, but they have to have very clearly implementing agency with very clear objectives. Below you have duties, structures, and joint tasks. But a third very important element or governance element that I have not seen in many places is the organization of intra and inter-organizational teams. Many of the day-to-day activities, that little aspects, that small elements of policies, have to be implemented by teams focused on activities. Those teams hardly ever exist in implementation. Of course, these processes have to be transparent, they have to be fully informed, they have to be clearly accessible to everybody, to the public at large, and also to specific STI interests. Another related challenge is a challenge of coordination. I was in one of the countries that I was working on, I found out that only 25% of the actions required to implement a policy, only 25% were responsibility of the ministry in charge. 75% of the actions were dispersed in many other ministries, many other agencies. In order to implement, you must coordinate, because you just cannot implement any policy if all these dispersed agencies do not get involved. Now, how do you go about that? You have to create multi-stakeholders implementation committees, working groups, teams. There must be a selection mechanism to organize these teams that ensures that the relevant organizations or people are part of it. Third is rotating managerial responsibilities. One day one agency has a responsibility, another week somebody else has a responsibility. Focal points in all organizations are also necessary, because those are the repositories of knowledge of those organizations and fit into that. And finally, it is critically important that the central agencies follows up on the tasks and ensure that they are delivered on time and as expected. A few years ago, I would not have talked about this, but today it's impossible to get much things or get anything done without getting the media, and especially social media, involved. Now, to implement STI policies, you need public support, and you need the interest groups that support it to be part of that public support. Nowadays, the main media to do that is social media, to some extent the press, but mainly social media. So it's critically important to identify media outlets that are used by STI communities to disseminate information. As soon as you identify those, begin a press and a social media campaign, a massive press and social media campaign to get to coalesce interest and coalesce social groups around the STI policy. You can use internet platforms, you can use Facebook, Twitter, whatever, but that is very, very critically important nowadays. Finally, ensure that the information that you provide is easy to understand, fully useful and comprehensive. I said earlier that implementation challenge is a managerial exercise, and you need managers. One of the biggest weaknesses that I've seen in this work I've been doing is that they never entrust implementation processes to managers, and it is managers that run it. They do not have to run the design process, but they do have to run the implementation process. And you need expertise, and you need capabilities. You need technical expertise, you need holistic thinking, you have problem solving, you need communication experience, you need good networks. And managers must have available adequate implementation mechanisms, the capacity to give executive orders, to provide, to have administrative mechanisms to implement, they have to be able to enact rules and regulations. Finally, of course, without resources, nothing can be achieved. And implementation involves using of resources, and involves using of financial resources for consultants, interview, studies, travel. It involves the right mix and level of human resources. And here, the types of expertise are slightly different than in design. You need managers, you need some experts, you need communication professionals. All these inputs are required. And finally, you require access to knowledge. You can build it on the basis of your epistemic community, on policy research, and occasionally we international organizations can help in this process. My final remark here is that it is important to keep in mind that the extent of the implementation challenge depends always on the degree of institutional sophistication of a particular in a particular country. So let me rephrase this. Yeah, the extent of the challenge will always depend on the degree of sophistication of a particular country, although even the most advanced countries have always implementation problems. Second point I wanted to make is the more elaborate an instrument, the more complex implementation process needs to be. Conversely, for instruments that are less sophisticated and have less impact, a more straightforward approach can be taken. Thirdly, during implementation stage, complexities are more in the social, political, and managerial processes than in the technicalities of the instruments. And finally, implementation processes need time. Don't cut corners or reduce the processes because the length of time required for the process for political expediency, because that is a recipe for not being able to implement. And I think I have exceeded my time, but there we go. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Ludo, for this very interesting presentation on the implementation challenges. You really raised very important issues on governance, coordination, resources, managerial responsibilities. And please, if some of you would like now to quickly raise some clarification aspects, please. I can see a raised hand by Sergio Pereira. Please have the floor.
Thank you, Cornelia. I'm Sergio Pereira from Mozambique, from the Ministry of Science and Technology and Higher Education. And thank you, Ludo, for your very comprehensive presentation. My question is very short. It's about the managerial positions in STI. In Mozambique, like in many African countries, most of the top managers are not in the public sector, namely ministers and so on. But the ministers are the institutions responsible for STI coordination and implementation of policies. So due to the brain drain, how do you think that we as implementers of STI can overcome that problem? Because we do not have top STI workers. Thank you very much.
Well, this another question? No.
Yes, please, Ludo.
Yes, okay. Look, resource limitation is always something that every country confronts at different levels, but it's a resource. And in terms of acquiring managerial capabilities, these are available. It's just that they have to be bought. So you need the funding to buy them. You can import people, or you can bring them from your own private sector. Those are the two options to. Now the question is then, how do you raise resources? No, and how do you raise resources for STI? Now, of course, that is a much broader question because it involves resources in general for the country. But as far as STI, I think one should fight the corner of getting a bigger part of the pie. Yeah, and getting a bigger part of the pie means getting a larger allocation of budgetary resources to STI activities. Now, to do that, you have to have a coalition of, and this is for what I keep try saying, it's more of a political and social process as a managerial one. You must have very strong minister, very a president or a parliament that believes strongly in STI. You have to generate a coalition of forces that puts priority on STI and that can push that agenda through the different political processes to ensure that the distribution of resources in the budget is adequate for STI. Now, of course, it has to be backed by solid technical arguments related to specific instruments, in this case, management. But I think that where the weakness arises is more in the weaknesses of the political and social processes to support the enhancing of priorities of STI.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ludo, for this additional clarifications. I see Wilhelmina raising her hand from Ghana. Please, Wilhelmina, keep in mind also that we will also have a open discussion after the next presentation, but please take the floor.
Okay, thank you. I think I want to thank the presenter, but I want to also add that in the case of building the pressure to cause a change from the managers, so be, I would want to add that it is also very good to using the champions to also look at the issue of mainstreaming, and which sometimes can also become a challenge, and which is also very important for the managerial's capability to look at mainstreaming, because STI, we have mentioned that it is cross-cutting, so there should be that opportunity to mainstream in all other sectors, so that the issue of funding can also be money. Thank you.
Agree.
Yeah. Thank you, Wilhelmina. Ludo, shall we move to the next presenter?
Yes,
and
yes,
then
please,
you still intervene in the open discussion. So please let me introduce you to our United Nations Economic Commission of Europe, Mr. Lars Jonensen, who would also present few examples to illustrate also these implementation challenges that we face through the process of STI policy instruments. Lars, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Good afternoon and good morning and maybe good evening for some to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Unfortunately, my colleague Ralph Heinrich, who has worked on this with you and who was supposed to present, is unfortunately ill this week, so I got to step in at the last minute. But first of all, let me congratulate everyone to an excellent pilot. I'm very impressed by some of the things that we're trying out here, and I think it's actually a good example because we've been learning how to do these virtual meetings very, very quickly. We're adapting, we're understanding the constraints and the dynamics and how to deal with them in a very, very quick time, in 9 months. And this stands in contrast to many high-level, strategic, high-profile initiatives that we've seen in the UN system and everywhere, but hasn't led very much. We're supposed to be innovative, we're supposed to use technology. We didn't. When we had to telework, when we had to do meetings online, all of a sudden we started becoming very innovative. And this shows us, I think, a central point that I'm sure you've heard before, but it's actually very important to understand how to get these processes right and how to follow the edicts that Ludo just presented. Innovation is basically 1% about invention and technology and 99% about figuring out what to do with it. And I think this is actually a good illustration of that. It didn't work top down, it worked when it had to work. Then we did it. And we see amazing momentum compared to many other areas when we've been trying to push for something top down. So this is also important to understand from a policy process perspective. Innovation is inherently unpredictable. If you remember the WSIS report from 2005, world-leading expert, 400-page report, no mention of social networking, no mention of cloud computing, and no mention of mobile internet. Fast forward just a couple of years later, and obviously the world was completely different. And any plan, any 5-year plan that would have been made on that basis, even though you had the best experts involved, would of course have missed the mark. So this is important to keep in mind. It basically means that we need a fundamental shift in how we govern, in how we set the rules of the games, and especially when it comes to vertical support mechanisms, how we actually get them right, given that we don't know in advance what's going to work. So what I'm going to say now is complementing basically what Ludo said about commitment, buy-in, interministerial coordination. These are all very important. Although of course we have to treat all of this with caution. For instance, if you do have high-level government commitment, it might also be that everyone tries to do something that turns out to be misguided, because then otherwise the minister would look politically bad. So it's important also to treat this with caution and to formulate these things in the right way, and to be and to be flexible and see what comes out of it. Since I don't have much time, I'm not going to talk much about what we do here at UN-IATT, although I'm supposed to. But suffice it to say that we're working with countries in transition in the region, so mostly post-communist countries. And we're doing reviews of the national innovation system. So we have a pretty good understanding of the common challenges and opportunities, and especially some of the institutional and process legacies that we see recur in all of these countries, which are still arguably in many ways in a transition process towards building a market economy, which of course has been much more difficult and a much more rocky path than many expected in the beginning, or at least hoped in the beginning. One publication that we just launched is an innovation policy outlook, which compares and contrasts the scope and quality of policies, innovation policies, but also processes and institutions and institutional capacities, and monitoring evaluation across 6 countries in Eastern Europe and South Caucasus. It was just launched, and we'd be happy to share it with people, and maybe also encourage similar initiatives for other country groupings inside the EC region or outside it. So first of all, I wanted to just, as a background, I know most of you know this, but I think it's important to reiterate. Innovation can happen across the board. We very often see in these countries, but also in other countries, a focus on technology, focus on research, and recently also a very, very strong focus on startups. There's a lot of kind of looking at what happened in Silicon Valley and other places and trying to template it. Although we know that most of the time, you know, this habit that we might have of trying to template and trying to use what we call best practices in another context, mostly doesn't work. In fact, it leads to what some economists call isomorphic mimicry. Looks and feels like the right institutions set all the right keywords, but it's not actually fulfilling the function, and it's missing the point that Silicon Valley emerged organically. And what enabled it to work was that there was a system in place that enabled experimentation for people to find out what works. And then once it worked, it was there were the provisions in place and the capital in place to scale up. So this can't be planned, but it can be facilitated. And this should be at the core of innovation policies in institutions. It's not about telling people what to do, picking technologies, or even picking sectors. It's about enabling and promoting systematic experimentation with new ideas. It doesn't need to be technology. It often involves technology. It sometimes involves research, but often not. Many of the examples that I've been working with that involve sectors like construction, or childhood, or childcare, or nursing homes. Definitely not in the technology sector, and actually, arguably, Uber and Airbnb or even Amazon are actually not technology companies. But Amazon is a cloud computing arm that's the strongest. But what we know about Amazon is actually a marketplace with pretty much the same business model as the ancient souks. So it's very important to take this broad perspective. Another specific feature of innovation is that we don't know it and that it's incredibly risky. Even venture capitalists that only pick among projects that have reached a certain level of maturity, about 90 to 95% of those projects fails. It's the 5% that work that create the return and the dynamic that makes it worth it. And it's exactly the same from a government's perspective. It's about encouraging and to some extent subsidizing people to make sure that more things are tried out than otherwise. But, and importantly, and this relates to the processes, it cannot be the case that the success is then measured on the subsequent performance of the individual targets for support. It's about the success in aggregate, and especially what we call the social return, the spillovers, everything that's external to the specific company that we want to get there. And we have many good examples of that. Some other speakers talked about this. In Belarus, for instance, there was an investor called Idan, which invested in IT outsourcing services, starting with relatively basic one and then becoming more and more sophisticated. I can't underscore enough how important these pilot investors are, because it's not about the success that they have, it's about that they showed to other investors, to other entrepreneurs, to the whole of society that yes, you can do this in Belarus. And then of course, subsequently, a whole new sector emerged. I can tell you similar stories of, you know, salmon fishing, cat flowers. There's a small automotive supply sector in Moldova. Always the same dynamic. The problem is that this is not happening far from systematically, and this relates to the market failures that we know of, information deficit, cost of self-discovery. If you decide to invest in something that's risky and you fail, you have to pay for all of it. If you succeed, you don't get all of the return because other people would come in and invest in the same. So even in a perfectly working market, this is going to happen systematically. That's at least not going to happen systematically. And that's the biggest rationale for public support. And this means that we need these vertical support instruments that kind of try to reduce the risks that individual initiatives might have, to make sure that more things happen than otherwise would be the case, that it has a catalytic effect. And this is at the core of the IPO that we did, and it's also at the core of challenge of setting up the right processes and institutions for innovation policy. You need to systematically make assumptions and vet them and try things out, and most importantly, know when things are not working and stop doing them or change them or do something different. And this is, of course, very difficult in the traditional approach, when you might plan, you might target a specific sector, a specific technology, and you might plan activities for 5 different years, and then everyone has an incentive to do exactly what is in that plan, because that is what they are measured on, and this can lead to massive misallocation of public resources, especially in an environment where your fiscal space is inevitably going to be significantly more constrained than it was before, because of the social and economic spending that's necessary to mitigate the effects of the pandemic. So let me, having said that, let me go through some of the main points and some of the main findings and problems that we found along the different steps of the policy cycle. So the policy cycle is basically, you start with the preparation, then you go to the design phase, then you implement it, and then you have monitoring, evaluation, and then monitoring, evaluation, then feed into the preparation process and the design process. It's a stylized version. In fact, many things happen at the same time. On the policy preparation side, it's important to engage in regular forecasting exercises. Now, forecasting is not meant to predict the future. It's meant to raise awareness about things that might happen, opportunities that might come up, constraints that might be growing, to guide at least some of the basic assumptions that will have to underpin any kind of vertical or horizontal policy intervention, for that matter. It's important to identify and quantify the constraints. So let's say this sector is not emerging in this country. Why is this happening? And then you get into a discussion of different kinds of market failure, network externalities, what have you. That we could have a long training just on what these actually mean, because they're actually important to understand. Sometimes you don't have a market altogether. Some innovation actually creates new markets, especially platform-based innovation. But that's a different topic too. But you need to understand pin down as much as possible what is the actual problem. Why is this not taking place otherwise? And then you need to decide if government or if policy should do something about this at all. Would it be able to be effective? Would it have the capacities to do so. Perhaps even more importantly, the incentives to do so. You have to weigh up basically market failure against the risk of government failure, because government cannot do everything. In fact, there are many things that we know that government doesn't do well. I'm sure we're all familiar with them, and we need to be aware of what these constraints are. Then we need to think about what the potential social return could be, the positive spillovers, creating new sectors, showing the viability of a specific technology, creating a platform upon which other kinds of entrepreneurship can happen. And also, of course, environmental sustainability, inclusion, creating opportunities for people living in rural areas, or women that need flexible, and men, of course, that need flexible opportunities because they're taking care of the children. And then what the difference of what the intervention could be and how we know this. So we need to quantify this. So remember, someone said when you have a hammer, everything is a nail. If you're working with I don't know what the credit guarantee mechanisms, for instance, you're going to want to solve everything with credit guarantee mechanisms. Innovation, this mostly doesn't work because the risk is so great. A bit of subsidized credit, it's not going to make the difference between whether it happens or not. In most cases, in some cases it might. Then you need to determine the potential interaction and complementarities with other policies. There are very common mistakes here. We've seen countries heavily subsidizing smart meters and energy efficient housing, while at the same time radically subsidizing energy. So there's no incentive. People are only going to do it if the government pays for it. It's not going to be a market dynamic that occurs there. And there are political reasons, of course, that it's very difficult to cut energy subsidies, as we've seen many times. Then you need to build these. Yes.
If you can just wrap up, because we are running a little bit late, and we would like to also have some interaction with the participants, please.
Yes.
Like that. Maybe in the open discussion, you could also address some of their concrete questions. Thank you.
2 minutes, is that okay? Good. I'll run through it. As you can tell, I'm passionate about these topics. And then, of course, consultations with the private sector. Again, here we have to be careful. The private sector will also lobby for their interests, and their established and entrenched interests, and for keeping any measures that benefit them. But you also need to consult with them to understand what the constraints and what the opportunities are, and make sure that you have sufficient autonomy to make decisions based on the potential return and based on the newness of an initiative. On the policy design and implementation phase, putting the policy together, then you need a process of developing policy options, going through regular impact and cost-benefit analysis, making sure to try to vet the trade-offs that could potentially occur, to accord sufficient flexibility to tweak support, to adapt to new circumstances or to specific needs that you might not have expected, to develop clear performance criteria at the output and also at the impact level, so you know whether it is working or not, and that you have a process in place so that if it's not working, you either change it or you drop it and you do something else. This is very, very important to have this in place and to think about this from the beginning. Important, especially if it's a new initiative, to pilot in a small scale and use control groups to see what the effect is. And I did a study even on Sweden at this, and there are very many problems with these vertical initiatives, even in a country that many people see as a good example in this area.
Shall we move to this interactive open discussion, please? I would like to invite participants to ask questions to the presenters, Ludovico, Lars, but also other colleagues from agencies who are here to interact with you. If some of you would like to ask questions, we will also address those in the chat. In the meantime, perhaps we can, I would like to invite Ludo and Lars maybe to take some of the questions that have been addressed in the chat, notably a question on the cost and how to how to plan and estimate and plan resources needed for the short, mid-term, and also long-term. If Ludo, you would like to take the floor on this. And there is also a participant interested in knowing a little bit more how to mobilize multi-stakeholder approach for the policy design and implementation. If you can start by addressing these two questions, and then I'll give the floor to the representative from Botswana, Madam Tamai. Ludo, would you like to start addressing these two questions?
Thank you, Osaki. On the costs, I just need to see the question. Okay, there are a number of dimensions here to the cost issue. Some have, on cost, there are two aspects that have to be looked into. One aspect is the cost of the measures themselves. Okay, and a first thing you're providing a subsidy or you're providing a grant. Okay, you're going to invest an amount of money. Okay, and that is the cost related to the measure itself. Now, as Anders was saying, okay, there are a number of techniques that you have to take into account. No? Cost-benefit analysis, you have to see the return of this, you have to compare, make choices, and see what are the alternatives. So there's a set of issues around that set of costs. Now, when you're planning, that is when you're planning longer term, there are also a number of techniques, forecasting, backcasting, different approaches to that can give you an idea, a very approximate idea of the cost of the long-term cost of a measure, of measures you are planning to introduce in the long run. I was recently involved in an exercise where we had to estimate the cost up to 20 years of some policy initiatives, and it was a very, very difficult task. We essentially, the closer the period, the more accurate our estimations would be. So within 1 or 5 years. Now, there's the other aspect that I think I wanted to raise, and I will just stop there because I can see you panicking. It's the issue of the cost of the measures themselves of implementation. And normally one doesn't think of that. But having been myself involved in implementation exercise recently, I saw how large could those be, and nobody ever thinks about this. Okay, because like getting managers, for example, are not available. So there are a number of implementation costs that are never foreseen, but that also have to be taken into account once you calculate costs. Yeah, I will.
Yes, thank you very much. Lars, would you like to comment on the question of how to mobilize and really ensure that there is a multi-stakeholder participation as far as the design and also implementation of policy instruments? This was a question in the chat.
Yeah, this is a big question, of course, but normally what you would have would be a mixture of formal and informal and ad hoc consultation mechanisms. Some of the formal ones might be on the top policy level to get input on policies, to scout problems with the innovation system or the general business environment, as we call it. We have many different names for this. Some of them might be sector specific. Some of them might be ad hoc around specific issues. In my experience, the ones that have worked have been the ones that have been clearly bottom up, with some relatively marginal support from government. In the automotive sector in Moldova, for instance, there was initially a German automotive parts manufacturer that did something very small. I think it was something to do with window mechanisms. They then required suppliers. People left the company with new skills, and more Moldovan activities developed. And after a while, they started coming together and thinking about what are the things that prevent us from taking advantage of more market opportunities, and they set up with time a consultation mechanism with first at the free zone level in which they were located, and then with government. And they're working on things like improving the appropriateness of skills, which of course is very important. The skills mismatch is extremely important in these countries, even though levels of tertiary education is relatively high. Almost all companies rank that even above access to finance, which is the classic #1 in most of the company surveys that I've seen. And that works because it was bottom down. On the contrary, many of the top-down cluster initiatives that I work with are turning into more mechanisms for rent seeking. To be quite honest, so it's important to be flexible. You need some formal mechanisms, but many of these should be basically signaling to the private sector. If you want to, let's talk about what innovation you would like to do, what the opportunities are, and what you need for that.
Thank you very much, Lars. I would like to give the floor to Mrs. Lesegutamae. Please, Madam.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentations. Let me maybe follow up on the costing one, Ludo, that when you do the costing for implementation of the policy and you don't have some key stakeholders in place, for instance, how do you assign where the source of funding, for instance? Because usually when you come up with a cost, the question would be, and where is that money going to come from? I have a question in the chat. I think that will be addressed in there. And then last day you mentioned forecasting in during the policy. Is there a difference between forecasting and foresighting? If so, what are the differences really? I think I'll just make those two. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam, for these questions. I would just check if there are more hands raised. For the moment, not. Ludo, other colleagues as well, please, if you would like to answer our participants from Ghana, from Botswana.
Yeah,
Ludo, would you like?
Before answering, I would like to invite our colleagues from the IATT that are here present also to chip in and come up with some either questions or answers, because we are not the only members of this effort, and much of the knowledge is available beyond that. So I would like to invite our colleagues to get involved. Now, there were two questions. One I didn't understand well. There's a question in the chat that's written, and the question in the chat is, how can you implement managerial rotation among groups? And I think that is relatively simple. You just you identify the key stakeholders. Take for example, or education. So you want to start a program of technical education in order to improve the contributions or in a company. Then what normally happens is the ministry makes a team inside the ministries and invites all the other ministries and have a big team of, and which is run by the Ministry of Labor. And that what I could do, but who's going to be implementing is probably the private sector. It's going to be a few private schools and with some companies, large companies. So the logical thing for me to do there would be create a team, a multi-stakeholder team, and give the responsibility for coming with the solutions to the private sector or to the company, the leading companies who already may have experience and experimenting with some technical training, for example. You know, it doesn't have to be the government that leads policy teams all the time. It could be, depending on the activity, on the specialization, that leading activity could be passed on to private sector, NGOs, academia, whoever can perform the better job. And that's what I mean. And then you rotate it. Different activities, different specializations have different kinds of managers, rather than only putting the management in certain organizations. That's what I mean by rotating. On the question of the cost, I was not very clear about it. what was the point? When you do not have stakeholders, when key stakeholders are not part of the policy process, you bring them in. It's as simple as that. And I think they look in many developing countries, many countries in Latin America, the main spenders in R&D are the 200 largest companies. Okay. Now, if you're going to come up with an R&D program to stimulate R&D, certain types of R&D, okay, and those companies are not part of the process, you have to bring them in. You cannot avoid having them in, and in fact, they may become very good allies. They may agree with governments or the implementation agent on what can be done together to develop certain technologies or certain innovation process. So that's the key stakeholders must be in. Now, one way. A lot of what I've seen in recent years has been a lot of window dressing and tokenism. No, yes, you invite the private sector, but you invite 3 or 4 companies that are friends of the minister or cousins, and that is not that clearly doesn't work. No, you have to include, even if they are going to be a bit reticent, the key stakeholders, and just invite them and find the mechanisms to include them. If that was a question, because I'm not sure that was, by the way.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Ludo. There was also a question about difference between foresight and forecasts, if I'm not mistaken. Any one of our IATT colleagues who would like to comment and answer this question? I think we can.
I can say a few words.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, just a few comments there. Just maybe first on the cost issue. Of course, there are several. I understood it more as an issue of budget planning, but if it's about the magnitude of costs, what we have definitely found is that in most cases, it's actually not a matter of ramping up public spending. It's about using it better and using it more efficiently and having the right parameters and stop what's not working, scale up with this. There are many countries that are experimenting with links between the opportunity costs that you might have and the additional revenue that you might get, such as additional tax revenue, and link that to funding for programs. Sweden, for instance, is doing this after the financial crisis. They imposed a range of constraints like this, which are actually working pretty well in constraining and making sure that the support is sufficient. Many countries are also experimenting with venture capital, maybe taking equity stakes in venture capital funds. They add a public mandate to that. The advantage of that is that A, you can leverage the funds with debt, and B, you will be able to recoup and reinvest some of the returns. Because at the end of the day, the point is to subsidize risk. The point is not to give money to people who are successful. If they are successful, they should be able to pay it back. In many countries, in fact, do the opposite of that. So there are many ways in which that would be cost neutral or even save costs if we can get these processes right. That's why they are so important. On the issue of forecast and foresight, I mean, sometimes people use these terms interchangeably. Forecast tends to be maybe sector specific and sometimes even company specific. Foresight tends to be maybe more long-term sustainable development perspective. They're both important. You need to have in mind what can happen, but they also need to be updated regularly. And when you develop plans and institutions and processes, don't do them around specific assumptions that might not play out. Do them around basically promoting things that are new and that might have social return and making sure more happens than otherwise would be the case. And there are many practical examples of doing this. We don't have time to get into it, but it's to me, it's by far the most important point of reform that's needed in the countries that we've been working with.
Thank you.
Just a few points that emerged during the think that one of the key contributions from in my understanding from Chloe's presentation is that policy instruments for the sake of policy instruments don't make sense. Policy instruments must have this directionality. They must link. They must be. They are tools for a purpose, and that is very important. Very important to keep in mind. Another point that also coincides with some of the points I was making is the participatory nature of both policy design and policy implementation. The participants and the approaches are different, but the level of participation should be similar in both stages of the policy process. Then both Ralph, both Anders and Clovis have mentioned, and I think everybody would agree with this, the importance of monitoring and evaluating policy design, policies, once they have been implemented. It is critically important both for learning purposes and also for termination purposes, because one of the points that Anders was making is that policies that don't work need to be terminated. And it is important that we go through a proper process of evaluation to see what policies need to be terminated. Nicola was raising the issue of cooperate or compete. I found that very interesting. Should companies should there be competition or cooperation between? Should governments force cooperation amongst entities or agents and stakeholders, or should allow them to compete? What's better, and under which circumstances one thing might be better and what might not be? I also think that one of the main challenges of implementation is that a coordinated, systemic, and very determined approach to STI policy, with strong leadership and very strong governance and transparency. And I'd like to end up with one point that Anders, sorry, Anders was reminding us that governments are not perfect either. Okay, so where there's a lot of market failures and there's lots of opportunities for governments to intervene, while governments must be able to judge when they are capable of doing things and when they are not capable of doing things. And I would add that when not capable of doing things, but things have to be done with other stakeholders in order to implement or design policies. I would like to thank all of you for attending this seminar. We have one more next week, which is going to be focusing on entrepreneurship and innovation.
Also, I think for the next session, our colleague from UNCTAD, Dimo, you would like maybe to say a few words to the participants for the next session? Dimo, please.
Thank you, Cornelia. Among other things, we're going to be looking at a couple of cases of actual entrepreneurs trying to be innovative. And with that in mind, I'm going to share with you in today or tomorrow with the participants the actual text of the case studies. I plead with you to please read them before next Thursday and to maybe have a thought or two, maybe make some notes on the side for yourselves on them, because the way this works is we're not going to have time to actually read through the cases. They're very short. They're half a page to 2/3 of a page each. There's 4 of them. Please, 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 in order to have a nice discussion next Thursday, please read the case studies before Thursday. Hope to see you all next time. Thank you very much. And of course, many thanks to the Workstream 6 team. It was once again a great session. Thanks for everyone. Bye-bye.
Can you please all turn your cameras on, because we are going to try